I'm just going to go back to some of your reflections on the shrinking civic space, and the securitization of dissent, and how Muslims are sort of specifically under the crosshairs in that securitization of dissent. And from your perspective, and of course from the perspective of sacred activism, where do we find our courage? You spoke of courage. Where do we find our courage? And in the face of state sort of pushback, how do we gain the confidence in our objectives, in the legitimacy of our objectives, but also in continuing to uphold and fight for our objectives? So a bit of a long question, but you have 2.5 minutes to respond.
I think I would like Imam to also contribute on this. I think the first thing is that it's very easy to lose sight of your very noble objectives. Take Islamophobia. Islamophobia coming out of a persecution of people, particularly because of their ideas. Okay, this is something that has been part of the shrinking civic space. 20 years ago, it was about these ideas of Islamic politics, whatever that may be. Right? Now it's just literally about wearing hijab to school. It's gone to something else, right? Doesn't mean we don't fight for that. But there's been a shift in the understanding of the Muslim subject, okay, that's being persecuted even. And we have also slipped in our understanding of ourselves, okay, so and that's because of the asymmetry of power, right? This is not a kind of accusation. Why? We've all done that, right? But taking it back to the sacred, it's about always having to reevaluate yourself. It is both a personal thing, but it's very important, and I've struck by what Imam said, that we need teachers, okay? So civil society organizations generally don't tend to be made up of ulama. We need to have that relationship that connects. And I think it has to be the broader space of ulama, you know, whether it's from X, Y, Z, college or Mumbai, South or whatever, right? We all need to understand that we can learn from each other. I forget the second part of your question, but maybe I'll give the mic to Imam.
Sheikh Abdul Hakim, may Allah preserve him, he said something important earlier as relating back to intention, niyyah, and why we are here and how we're functioning. A good friend of mine, Dr. Bilal Ware, may Allah preserve him, I'm quoting him directly, and I'll just make a couple more comments relating to that. He said, for many Muslims, capitalism is our religion and Islam is our ritual observance. Meaning that our real reason why we live is for middle class respectability. That's our real goal. That's our real, why we live here, you know. And then Islam is our ritual worship, meaning we have a beard or hijab, we may pray 5 times a day, we may fast, we may eat certain types of meat and don't eat certain types of meat. But in reality, what we live for at our very basis of core is middle class respectability. Capitalism. Now, one of the things about reframing ourselves is that words have power. And we need a language shift, I believe, amongst Muslims in the West. And I believe that Muslims in this middle class respectability chase, this bridge to nowhere, that we've been so quick to seek acceptance from other people or be underneath other people's umbrella that we've forgotten to call people towards what we believe in our values. And going back to this community, this Fard Kifaya, Allah Azza wa Jalla says, وَلْتَكُمْ مِنْكُمْ أُمَّةٌ يَدْعُونَ الْخَيْرِ وَيَأْمُرُونَ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَيَنْهَوْنَ عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ وَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْمُفْلِحُونَ. Relating to success. Let there be amongst you an ummah, a group that calls toward khair. What? Meaning giving da'wah. And enjoins the justice and forbids the injustice. And these are going to be the successful ones, right? So this is what Allah Azza wa Jalla says. So if we're not being successful, then as a community, then perhaps we need to reframe of how we're positing ourselves and summon up the moral courage to fulfill these three conditions that Allah says if we fulfill, we will be successful as Muslims no matter where we live at. Right? But so it's a repositing in our language. And I also say this, and I'm sorry if I'm taking too long. Our sohbah, our companionship, is also very important. If you or myself are around a bunch of weak people, it's going to weaken us. Likewise, if you're around someone who is stronger and more resolved in their faith and their objectives, it's going to strengthen you, because the believers were like blocks on a building. One block strengthens the other. We're told this by our beloved alayhi salam, right? So if it's straw, if it's a house built with straw, it's going to fall, right? Allah knows best.
So I just wanted to just follow up on that, what you said about our religion or our life or our aspiration being capitalism. But I think one of the other things that has happened, and I see this because I have teenagers of my own, is that in response to that and in this vacuum where people are scared to talk about Islam as transformative for society as a whole, you now have a whole generation coming up who are putting a bismillah again on socialism and Marxism in a way that I thought I'd kind of seen the end of, not because I had some kind of hatred of Marxism and communism, I came through that route as an activist myself, but because there just doesn't seem to be anything else. So again, we have to break this cycle. I was absolutely excited to listen to Professor Arzu earlier talking about the Islamic moral economy, because the amount of times I hear, well, you know, if only we all just gave sadaqah, then there wouldn't be poor people, as a kind of Islamic solution. Yes, there is a truth in that, but it's also not as simple as just giving your sadaqah to XYZ aid organisation, right? Which is how we've been forced into simplifying our belief system. There was another point that came to my mind, but it's gone.
Thank you, Arzu. So just thinking about, you know, some of the discussions from this morning, especially, I think it was, I don't know how to pronounce his name, it's the professor from Turkey. He talked about challenging dualisms. Rajab. Okay, Rajab. He talked about challenging dualisms, right? And so one of the sort of dualisms of our time is the private and public space, right? Religion has to be privatized, and it cannot have a space within the public. And it's really important to bring these frameworks, especially Dawud's framework of sacred activism, into how we tether the sacred and the everyday and the private and the public. So in relation to that sort of line of thinking, I have a question for you about means. Your framework involves, you know, the objectives, but as well as the means, and of course the intention. So just focusing on the means now. Perhaps you're not aware of the British context, but just recently we had a series of protests around the climate crisis called Extinction Rebellion, where by a group of protesters, rightly so in my opinion, were sort of stimulating the disruption that climate change would have on our everyday lives. So they were disrupting transportation, they were disrupting delivery of goods, they were disrupting people going to work, people going to hospitals, people going to school. So now thinking and reflecting about your reflections on adab and the means we take to dissent, what would be your perspective on engaging in those kinds of mobilizations?
I believe in protests. And I believe that there are certain times to rally and raise our voices as a community. I also believe that the means, again, are very important. There is a very important hadith that is so comprehensive. It's in the books of Islamic law. لا ضرر ولا ضرار ولا ضرر ولا ضرار في الإسلام. That there is no harm, no reciprocating harm in Islam. So when we're talking about our protesting, we should also factor in are we going to violate anyone else's rights involved in our protesting, right? Is our disruption to the point that we're blocking a road where, let's say, emergency vehicles need to come down by, if there's some sort of public emergency, and we could stop an ambulance from coming to save someone's life or a fire? I'm just using this example. It's actually happening in the States, by the way, with the Black Lives Matter protests. It's actually happening. I'm not just saying this theoretically, I'm just using this as an example, right? These things should be factored in the means that we protest or the ways that we seek to disrupt. Then also, if we're trying to change hearts and minds of the general public, because see, when we're talking about protests or rallies, normally it's only a minuscule percentage of the population that is involved in the protest. Then there are the masses of the people that aren't involved in the protest. And if that disruption is potentially or will cause some sort of, not just a minor inconvenience, but could cause some further harm to individuals by that disruption, you're actually going to turn them, they're not going to join you in your cause. Not the masses of them. And some of them you may actually turn off. So we have to factor this in. I am for, I'm in favor of protesting, and I also believe that we should have in the community good cop and bad cop type of thing. And what I mean by this, when Musa alayhi salam spoke to Fir'aun, he spoke to Fir'aun in person first. It wasn't a public action first. And we even have our authentic hadith about this. When you go to a ruler, if you have the access to, then you speak to that ruler in person a certain way. And then the masses of the people don't have access, then they maybe have a different type of action, right? And I know some people might have that framework, good cop, bad cop, because many people say there's no such thing as a good cop, right? Some people, right? And I know especially from the Black American experience, the institutionalized racism and police brutality is to the point that I'm skeptical of any police officer that I come in contact with, right? I mean, that's just my personal bias. But again, we have to be very careful in our calculation about the means. But some of these things are ijtihadi, and I think that in our community, that people who have different philosophies about these things should at least talk, so we're all trying to get to the same place. And we may be using different means, but it shouldn't be an issue of different Muslim community members publicly chastising other people in the community because they're using a means that could be a debatable means. Sometimes some things aren't just clearly right and wrong. Sometimes there's things that are gray in the middle, right? This is my opinion, but Allah surely knows best.
I think I would like to hear a female perspective on this question. Do you need me to repeat parts of it? Well, not to repeat everything, but if the objective of a particular mobilization is really to gain attention from the powers that be about your cause, because that is where the real changes are going to happen. The concern is not so much in mobilizing popular support. The concern is enacting real and deep structural changes. What's your perspective on, some means that might be disruptive to daily life?
I said I'll speak and then I got gobsmacked. I think there is a place for this type of direct action. There clearly is. But if you want to take particularly the Extinction Rebellion protests, and there is a split in that movement between the UK Students' Network and Extinction Rebellion about this strategy, I think there is a critique there which we need to think about more generally, which is that they disrupted lives of ordinary people. In fact, they disrupted lives in particular areas where they glued themselves to trains, etc., of the most marginalised communities in London, who were just trying to get to work. And these are the people who can least affect change. Okay, we're in a moment where our government literally doesn't care about most of the people in the country. We are in a kind of unencumbered, exposed time where it's the elite looking after the elite. That seemed to me to be a kind of long way to go. You know? And again, it's about the squeezing of this space. What is it that we can do? Because things that might have made sense 30 years ago, that type of direct action don't impact anymore. We do, I mean, our organisation organises protests and vigils and so on, but we are very wary of this, about the disruption aspect and about who we're addressing with that. And that's something over and over again. Who are you addressing? It might just be symbolic. Ultimately, the result in the hands of those apart, right? And it may be that, you know, your focus is not the general public, it is the structure. In fact, that's probably where we're at these days. Okay? Even if the general public became sympathetic, and oftentimes they do become sympathetic, they literally don't have power. This idea of the power in the ballot box is I think, long gone. So it's yes for direct action of all different sorts. A good example, personally, I think, are the kind of anti-deportation protests where people have chained themselves to people being deported or stood up on planes, etc. They've saved people's lives, right? But they're in a very discrete moment. Right now, the big mass direct actions, we have to think about them very clearly, because that unrestrained elite power is really what we need to target, and how that can be done effectively is maybe not messing up with the lives of the people who are suffering the most actually from that elite.
Thank you for that. I guess the argument by some proponents of the Extinction Rebellion tactics is that we are in a sort of planetary emergency which requires certain measures, but we can have a debate afterwards. I'm conscious of time, and unfortunately we'll have to bring this conversation to a close, but it's been certainly fascinating, and if you have any questions for the panelists, do find them somewhere sometime today.